Hello, and welcome to my tour of Cleeve Abbey. The Cistercian Abbey of Cleeve, which has some of the best preserved monastic buildings in England, was founded in the late 12th century between 1186 and 1191 by William de Rumar, Earl of Lincoln, along with monks from Revesby Abbey in Lincolnshire. According to the English Heritage Trust, whom the abbey is entrusted to, had itself been founded by William's grandfather. From the drone footage we see the gatehouse and precinct. Cistercian houses were normally enclosed by precinct walls, and traces of them can still be seen on the west side of Cleeve. The precinct comprised 11.3 hectares, 28 acres. The northern and eastern sides seem to have been enclosed by wood moats, parts of which can still be seen on the north side. The main gatehouse was built in the 13th century, although, in its present form, it largely dates from a 16th century remodeling. The entrance is flanked by buttresses which are topped by grotesque figures. Above the entrance arch there is a square panel carved with the name of Abbot Dovel, with a crozier, and surrounded by a vine trail. There is a square-headed window with a crucifixion seen in the gable above. The figure of Christ is supported by an angel holding a shield. Smaller angels appear at each side, supporting miniature buttresses. Above is a large polygonal canopy. The gatehouse interior originally had two main gates in the gate passage, a large one for wheel traffic and a small one for pedestrians. Both these gates were controlled by the abbey porter. The passage was originally vaulted, though only the springings now survive. In the 17th century, a farmhouse was built on the west side of the abbey's south range. This was eventually divided into 3 cottages and rented out to tenants. The ground and first floors of the farmhouse are now used to display various artifacts discovered in excavations at the site. These include examples of tiles, metalwork, and pottery, together with some splendid fragments of tombs. The official name of the abbey was Vallis Florida, Latin for flowering valley, but throughout its history it was generally known as Cleeve after the nearby village. A modest income from endowments of land proved sufficient enough to build the stone monastery according to the strict principles of simplicity, which is characterized by the Cistercian order. The monks of Cleeve followed a strict daily regime. Although their standard of living rose over the centuries, they kept to the main principles of monastic life. The Cistercian order, to which Cleeve belonged, was one of the most successful monastic reform movements of the Middle Ages. The monks who founded the order in 1098 wanted to return to a strict interpretation of the rule of Saint Benedict, which was followed by most monasteries in Western Europe, with a simplified lifestyle and services. Cistercian monks were expected to spend about a third of their waking hours in church for the 8 daily services, a third working in manual labor, or perhaps copying manuscripts, and a third reading sacred texts. They had to get up for night services, wore a rough, undyed wool habit, were only allowed 1 meal a day in the winter, and weren't allowed to eat meat. This austerity was also reflected in their buildings, which were often far plainer than those of other orders of monks or canons. As time went on, however, in common with the outside world, the conditions became less harsh, and Cistercian abbeys became more like those of other orders. At its peak in the 13th century, the abbey was home to 28 monks and supplemented its income by farming and from a pilgrimage at a nearby site at Blue Anchor Bay. However, the monks of Cleeve kept up the tradition of manual labor right to the end. We know this because a remarkable account survives from 1589 by farmers who were over 80 years old, who describe how the monks wore out their gloves pulling up broom plants. This stairway leads to the upper farmhouse and upper chamber. As we enter the upper farmhouse built in the 18th and 19th century, you will see artifacts uncovered from the grounds of the abbey exhibited for the public to see. The upper floors were also removed as part of the abbot's house that occupied the upper floor of the late medieval West Cloister Range. They are equipped with small fireplaces, possibly dating from the time that the farmhouse was built. The West Range once extended northwards to the church. In the left-hand wall is a fine late medieval window. There were once additional windows in the opposite wall, but only the blocked frame of one is now visible. The main feature of the room is the fireplace. This has a 13th century tomb cover, complete with cross-decorated with foliage, as a lintel. It would originally have been plastered over. At the time of the suppression, grave robbery was common, so it is no surprise to find a tomb cover used in such a way. Beyond the upper farmhouse building, we now enter the upper chamber. This is the second floor room above the painted chamber and lobby. It may have been the private apartment of a senior monk. Access to this level was originally by a staircase entered from the cloister. It has been largely destroyed, but the upper doorway survives in the north wall, and its broken shell can be seen on the outside of the building. There are faint traces of a wall painting just to the right-hand side of the fireplace. This is part of a larger decorative scheme and shows a panelled column with a diagonally placed spear across the front, possibly an instrument of the crucifixion and passion of Christ. Above the fireplace, and on part of the opposite wall, is a series of radiating lines in red. The presence of the wall paint certainly suggests that the room was of high status. After the suppression, the room was divided in two and a plaster ceiling inserted. This has since been removed to reveal a roof similar to, but simpler than, the one in the refectory. These rooms can be dated to the same period. We now see the painted chamber. The location of this room and its decoration suggests that it served as an office, a checker, or more specifically, a counting house. It may also perhaps have been used as the abbot's secretariat. The present doorway was converted from a hatch set into the north wall. The original entrance was through the doorway from the lobby in the wall on the left. The painted chamber derives its name from a large, late 15th century wall painting on the left-hand wall. This shows a double-arched bridge over a river, with fish and eels swimming in the water. At the center of the bridge stands a richly dressed old man in an attitude of prayer, flanked by a lion and a horned dragon, and a pair of angels bearing instruments of the Passion of Christ, the scourge and crown of thorns. On the left is a figure of Saint Catherine of Alexandria holding a diminutive wheel, the symbol of her martyrdom, and on the right, Saint Margaret of Antioch standing on her symbol, a small dragon, which she is shown spearing with her staff. For many years, the meaning of the painting was lost, but recently, it has been identified as the legend of a man crossing a bridge from the Gesta Romanorum, Deeds of the Romans, a popular medieval collection of religious tales of unknown authorship. The rest of the room was also painted, and there are the remains of a fireplace in the west wall. We now enter the refectory. This was the communal dining hall where the monks took their main meals. This is the remodeled refectory. When it was first built in the 13th century, the south range comprised of the day stairs and warming room at the east end, and the kitchen at west, with the refectory projecting to the south from the center of the range. In the 15th century, the abbey was remodeled to adapt to changing needs. Much of the original range was demolished, and the new building we see was constructed and set parallel to the south cloister alley. Returning to what we actually see now in terms of construction and design of the refectory, the floor is made of mortar and laid over heavy boards, and the far end is raised slightly higher to form a dais. It was here that the abbot and the obedienturies, or senior monks, sat during meals. The ordinary monks sat at tables ranged along the side walls, and strict silence was observed during meals. On the right-hand wall towards the far end is a doorway that gave access to a pulpit from which one of the monks read aloud from scripture. The pulpit was destroyed, but its position is marked by a fireplace that was built later just to the right of the doorway. The windows on the right are glazed with 6 main lights in 2 banks of 3, divided horizontally by a transom, a stone bar, pierced by small, delicate quatrefoils, which is a local feature. On the left-hand side, the windows are shorter to allow for the cloister alley roof. As we exit the refectory building by staircase, we pass to the entrance to the Corodians' rooms. Corodians were in essence pensioners who lived in monasteries, lay people who paid, or were sponsored, to live there, and in some ways had served the monastic order in some way or other. When the South Range was remodelled in the 15th century, the ground floor was divided into two sets of rooms, providing high-quality living quarters. These are thought to have provided accommodation for either senior monks or Corodians. The first room was a living room, with a fireplace set in the south wall between two tall, rectangular shuttered windows which have window seats. The left is a doorway to the bedroom, which has a similar window and a barrel-vaulted latrine, or garderobe, flushed by an external drain. After the suppression, these rooms were converted to stables and cobbled floors were laid. The ceiling has heavy moulded beams and deeply chamfered joists. The triangular ceiling panel above the door is elaborately decorated with a series of carved trefoil three-lobed and quatrefoil four-lobed reliefs. This leads us to the cloister. Cloistered area of a monastery is an enclosed area, an open courtyard or walkway leading to other parts of a monastery where monks would meditate, study or exercise and would spend most of their time here when not attending services in the church. There was a walk or covered alley on each side, which was originally enclosed by open arcades of pointed arches supported on columns. The west alley of the abbey cloister was rebuilt in the late 15th century. It is now part of the farmhouse. In the southernmost room, the western wall contains two fireplaces, one with a bread oven and the other with a large timber lintel. Against the wall of the church, in the middle of this alley, is a trefoil-headed arch recess marking the position of the collation seat. This area is where the abbot sat during the daily spiritual reading. 4 arches survive in this west alley, with some remains of tracery and patches of limewash in places. This suggests that the stonework was painted white to brighten the dark alley. The north alley of the cloister ran parallel to the south aisle of the church, and at the west end there was once a doorway into the church, now marked by a disturbed area of masonry. We are facing the entrance to the chapter house. Traditionally, this is where the monks met on a daily basis to discuss business, confess faults, or receive punishments. The abbot sat at the centre of the east wall, directly opposite the door, flanked by the obedientiaries, those monks who held the positions of authority, such as the prior, novice master, sacrist, and cellarer. The rest of the monks sat on benches along the side walls. There was a daily reading from a chapter of the Rule of Saint Benedict, and the lead socket used to support the lectern is set into the floor at the east end. Until the 14th century, it was Cistercian custom to bury the abbots in the chapter house. After this time, the abbots were buried in the monastic church, and the tiled pavement would have been set with their grave slabs, though these have since been removed. The chapter house was richly decorated. The windows are divided by elegant columns of polished blue lias. Considerable traces of painted masonry pattern and red and yellow ochre pattern work survive on the vault webs on the ceiling, and the ribs were once painted with red rosettes. Immediately to the south of the chapter house, a doorway opens onto the day stairs, which the monks used to access the dormitory for a short rest following their main meal at noon. The day stairs were originally at the east end of the South Range, but when this was remodelled in the 15th century, they were moved to their present position. Few monastic dormitories have survived in anything like their complete state, and this room is one of the finest examples left in Britain. Although the roof is not original, probably dating to the 17th or 18th century, it forms a typical example of the local carpentry of that period. Today, as in the 13th century, the dormitory is a single open room. The monks slept on mattresses and, allowing space for these, and for the timber lockers and chests in which they kept their clothing. The size of the room suggests that it was built to house about 36 monks. In the 15th century, it was subdivided timber partitions into individual cells to allow the monks greater privacy. The room is lit by ranges of lancet windows which were closed to wooden shutters, some of which were later replaced with glass. At the north end is the doorway now locked to the night stairs that connected the dormitory with the church. There was also a second doorway to the northeast corner, which allowed access to the space above the south transept chapel vaults. High up at this end of the room are considerable traces of original limewash with a red masonry pattern, and many smaller traces survive in the side wall. The whole room must once have been decorated like this, and it would have been far lighter than today. The window sills have been turned into seats, many of which have had tiles set into them. In the east wall, on the right, are 2 later fireplaces. There are also several places where lost areas of medieval walling has been patched with rubble where holes had been knocked through, presumably to allow the building to be used as a hayloft when the abbey was a farm.
At the far end of the dormitory, the gable has been remodeled with a hipped or sloping end to the roof, but it is originally thought to have had a stone-gabled wall with three pointed lancet windows, traces of which remain. At the south end of the east wall is the doorway to the latrine or reredoter. Immediately to the south of the chapter house, a doorway opens onto the day stairs. The staircase winds around to the right and then to the left, which the monks used to access the dormitory for a short rest following their main meal at noon. The day stairs were originally at the east end of the south range, but when this was remodeled in the 15th century, they were moved to their present position. The 13th century doorway might have been reused from the original day stairs.
We are now entering the parlour.
Here, silence was strictly enforced in the cloister, and the parlour was the only room where necessary and brief conversation was allowed between the monks. The doorway is 15th century, from when the day stairs were altered.
The room contains several cupboards set into the walls and a pair of lancet windows.
The plastered barrel vault has several inscribed intersecting circles, possibly part of a larger decorative scheme, now lost. This area also leads to the slype or covered passageway that runs through the range from the main cloister to the infirmary cloister. In the south wall is the entrance to the warming room. The monastic year was split into two parts because of the relatively short period of daylight in the winter months, when the monks followed a less rigorous routine.
A fire was lit in the warming room on All Saints' Day, 1st of November, and was kept burning day and night until Good Friday, so that the monks could come in from the cloister and warm themselves.
In the winter, they could also grease their boots here.
The room is 3 bays long and has a modern concrete groin-vaulted ceiling.
In the side walls are traces of the original corbel stone brackets which once supported the vault. It forms the undercroft of the south end of the dormitory and was originally a workroom. The warming room was relocated here from the east end of the south range when the abbey was remodeled in the 15th century.
We are now entering the lodgings, 2 chambers containing 2 sets of rooms that were formed during the remodeling in the late 15th century.
Here, like the Corrodian room, senior monks or paying tenants would stay within these self-contained apartments.
4 Corrodians and pensioners have been identified at Cleeve in the early 16th century. Stephen and Margaret Jobsons, who had done the abbey a large pecuniary service, were given lodging in a great chamber beyond the gate and were provided by the abbey with bread, ale, candles, fuel and rent.
John Michael, who had been a singer in the abbey church, was given a daily allowance of bread, fish, meat, ale and fuel, as well as a chamber and a pension. In 1535, Edward Walker, described as a gentleman, paid an annuity of £27 in return for a chamber.
We will now turn the attention to the last part of the tour, the church ruins, and before this, we will see some more aerial footage of the abbey, and we'll finish with some of the history surrounding the suppression and other business of Cleeve. In the 1530s, Henry VIII put an end to medieval monasticism in England.
In 1533, he declared himself head of the English Church to resolve his dispute with the papacy over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon.
He then instituted a survey to value all church property, followed by an inquiry into the standards of religious life in the monasteries.
In 1536, an Act of Parliament closed all monasteries with an income of less than £200.
Cleeve was one of these. Henry VIII's pressing need for money meant that many monastic estates were quickly sold or leased to new owners.
In 1528, the king sold Cleeve's buildings and lands to the Earl of Sussex as a reward for his service in quelling the Northern Rebellion against the suppression of the monasteries.
Abbey Church was swiftly demolished so that it could no longer be used for services.
The church was the centre of Abbey life. It is quite small to many Cistercian churches and much ruined, with only parts of the south aisle and south transept remaining.
When the church was first excavated in the late 19th century by archaeologist C.H. Sampson, it was apparently deeply covered with rubble from its demolition.
The location of many of the walls and piers were marked out with concrete edgings by the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works in the 1960s. The aisle was lit, like most of the church, by narrow lancet windows, and the lower parts of 3 survive in the south aisle wall west of the door. The monks and the lay brothers worshipped separately. The lay brothers sat in the western bays of the nave for their simple services at the beginning and end of each day. The monks held their services in the eastern part of the church, near the high altar. The outlines of the stone sub-bases of their choir stalls remain in the eastern bay of the nave and part of the crossing. Each transept had 2 chapels on the east side, and the presbytery, which housed the high altar, was short and square-ended.
In the north transept, there is the raised base of an altar added against the arcade pier with a large tomb slab in front.
Many lay people sought to be buried within the walls of Cistercian monasteries.
They believed that the prayers of the monks would hasten the passage of their souls through the pains of purgatory to everlasting bliss in heaven. To gain the greatest spiritual benefit, their graves were often located in front of altars, on processional pathways, or sometimes on thresholds or entrances to ensure that the monuments were visible to the monks and other worshippers, who would be prompted to say prayers for the souls of the deceased.
It seems that the whole church was tiled in the late 13th century. The remains of a tiled pavement can be seen at the west end of the south aisle of the church. In the south transept wall, set high up, is the first floor doorway from the dormitory. A staircase once led to it from the church, allowing the monks direct access for nighttime services.
This brings me to the end of this tour of Cleeve Abbey. I hope you enjoyed this video.
If you did so, please help the channel. Give the video a like. Feel free to comment, and if you have not done so, consider subscribing to the channel.
The English Heritage Trust manages over 400 sites, including places like Stonehenge and Iron Bridge, along with the many castles throughout the country.
Membership costs. In 2024, family membership consisting of
family of 1 adult and up to 6 children £72 annually.
2 adults and up to 12 children £126 annually. That can alternatively be paid monthly, costing £6 and £10.50 a month respectively.
Individually, the cost is £72 and joint membership for 2 adults is £126, again can be paid monthly. Senior citizens and students are considerably cheaper. Also, membership to the English Heritage Trust also covers the Welsh Heritage Trust sites, and to the best of my knowledge vice versa.